The rain fell steadily outside, tapping a gentle rhythm against the window panes of the small London flat. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the comforting aroma of brewing tea. Old Jonathan sat in his favourite armchair, a steaming mug cradled in his wrinkled hands, his gaze lost somewhere in the grey, swirling mists over the city. His grandson, Henry, sat on the floor nearby, carefully building a tower of books. He looked up at his grandfather, a thoughtful expression on his young face. The silence was comfortable, broken only by the soft clink of a spoon against china and the persistent patter of the rain on the glass. "Grandad," Henry began, his voice quiet but clear, "why is tea so important to us, to the British?" Jonathan blinked, his thoughts returning from a distant past. He smiled faintly at the boy. "It's just a nice drink, isn't it?" he replied softly. But Henry wasn't satisfied with such a simple answer. He had been learning about the British Empire at school, about ships that sailed to faraway lands. He wanted to understand the connections, the real stories behind the things they took for granted every single day. He wanted to know the why. "But it's more than that, isn't it?" Henry pressed on, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Our teacher said the British went all the way to India for things like tea. Why? Why was it so special that we had to travel across the whole world for it?" Jonathan took a slow, deliberate sip from his mug, the warmth spreading through him. He looked from Henry's inquisitive face to the dark amber liquid in his cup. The boy was right. It was so much more than just a drink. It was a story of empires, of great wealth, and of immense hardship. It was a story that deserved to be told properly. He set his mug down on the small table beside his chair, the sound a soft thud in the quiet room. "You are right, Henry," he said, his voice gaining a little more strength. "It is a very long and complicated story. It begins a long time ago, not in India, but even further east in a land of emperors and dragons." He leaned forward, beckoning Henry closer. The rain continued its gentle drumming against the window, providing the perfect pensive soundtrack for a tale that would span centuries and continents, all contained within the history of a simple cup of tea. Long before it was ever a staple in British homes, tea was China's precious secret. For centuries it was a revered beverage, a symbol of culture, refinement and medicine, carefully cultivated and enjoyed within the borders of the great Chinese Empire. When the first shipments of this exotic leaf reached England in the 17th century, it was an instant sensation amongst the very wealthy. It was incredibly expensive, a luxury that only the aristocracy could afford. They sipped it from delicate porcelain cups in grand drawing rooms, a sign of their status and worldliness. But the British appetite for tea grew and grew, becoming a national obsession. This created a huge problem for Britain. China was the only place in the world that produced tea, and the Chinese demanded payment in silver. They were not particularly interested in the woolen goods or other products Britain had to offer. As a result, vast quantities of silver were flowing out of Britain and into China, creating a massive trade imbalance that the British government found alarming and unsustainable. They needed to find something, anything, that the Chinese would want to buy from them. The solution they found was as cynical as it was destructive. The British East India Company, a powerful trading corporation that acted almost like a government in its own right, began to grow opium in its territories in India. Opium was a highly addictive and illegal drug in China, but that didn't stop the British merchants. They began smuggling enormous quantities of it into the country, creating a devastating social crisis as millions became addicted. This illicit trade reversed the flow of silver. Now it was pouring out of China and into British coffers. When the Chinese emperor tried to stop the illegal smuggling and destroy the British opium stockpiles, Britain responded with military force, leading to the infamous Opium Wars. Defeated in the wars, China was forced to open its ports to foreign trade and cede territory, including Hong Kong to Britain. It was a humiliating chapter in China's history, all driven by Britain's insatiable desire for tea and its ruthless determination to balance its trade books. But even this wasn't enough. The British were still dependent on China for their tea supply. They dreamt of controlling the entire production process themselves. Their gaze soon turned towards the vast lands they controlled in India, wondering if the secret of the dragon's leaf could be transplanted there. The British were determined to break China's monopoly on tea. They sent spies, like the botanist Robert Fortune, on daring missions into the Chinese interior to steal precious tea plants and learn the secrets of their cultivation. At the same time, they discovered that a native variety of tea plant was already growing wild in the Assam region of northeast India. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The British East India Company began clearing vast areas of dense forest, transforming the landscape into sprawling tea plantations. This was the birth of the Indian tea industry, a project of immense scale and ambition. However, creating these plantations required an enormous workforce, and the local people were often unwilling to work in the difficult conditions. To solve this labour shortage, the British colonial administration put a system in place that was deeply exploitative. They recruited millions of impoverished people from other parts of India, often through deception and false promises of a better life. These workers, known as coolies, were transported to the remote tea gardens of Assam and Darjeeling, where they found themselves trapped in a life of grueling hardship and poverty, far from their homes. Life on the tea plantations was brutal. Workers, including women and children, toiled from dawn until dusk for pitifully low wages. They lived in squalid, overcrowded barracks with poor sanitation, and disease was rampant. The plantation managers and overseers ruled with an iron fist, and physical punishment was common. The workers were trapped by debt and restrictive contracts, making it almost impossible for them to leave. They were producing a drink that was becoming a symbol of comfort and civility back in Britain. But their own lives were filled with suffering and injustice. It was a stark and cruel irony. The tea that flowed from these gardens in India was cheaper and more plentiful than the tea from China. It poured into Britain, transforming the drink from an aristocratic luxury into an affordable daily ritual for the masses. The tea break became an institution in factories and offices, a cornerstone of British domestic life. But as families across Britain gathered for their afternoon cuppa, few, if any, would have known about the immense human cost. The comforting brew they enjoyed was steeped in the sweat and tears of countless forgotten workers on the other side of the world. As the 20th century dawned, tea was no longer just a drink in Britain. It had become an integral part of the national identity. Tea time was a cherished ritual, a moment of pause and social connection that punctuated the day for people from all walks of life. It fueled the workers in the industrial factories, comforted soldiers in the trenches of the First World War, and was the centerpiece of gatherings in homes from the grandest country estates to the humblest terraced houses. The British Empire, in many ways, ran on tea. The profits from this vast industry helped fund the colonial administration and enriched the British economy. Back in India, however, a different story was unfolding. The very plantations that supplied Britain's favourite drink became places of growing resistance. The Indian workers, though oppressed, were not passive victims. They began to organise, forming unions and demanding better wages, fairer treatment and improved living conditions. Small acts of defiance grew into larger strikes and protests. They were fighting not just for their rights as workers, but as human beings who deserved dignity and respect. Their struggle was a key part of a much larger movement that was sweeping across the subcontinent. The fight for justice on the tea plantations fed into the broader Indian independence movement. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi inspired millions to challenge British rule through non-violent resistance and civil disobedience. They argued that a nation that built its wealth on the exploitation of another people had no moral right to govern them. The call for Swaraj, or self-rule, grew louder and more powerful with each passing year. The Indian people were reclaiming their own story, demanding the right to determine their own future and control their own resources, including the very tea that had become so symbolic of British power. Eventually, the tide of history could no longer be held back. In 1947, after decades of struggle and immense sacrifice, India finally achieved its independence. The British Empire began to crumble, and a new era dawned. The tea plantations, once a symbol of colonial exploitation, were now in the hands of a sovereign nation. The story of tea was now inextricably linked with the story of India's fight for freedom. It was a powerful reminder that history is not just made by kings and conquerors, but also by the ordinary people who dare to stand up and demand justice. Jonathan finished his story, his voice soft in the now quiet room. The rain had eased to a gentle drizzle and the late afternoon light was beginning to fade. Henry had listened intently, his book tower forgotten. He looked at the half-empty cup of tea on the table with new eyes. It wasn't just brown water and a leaf anymore, it was a whole world of history full of ships and emperors, injustice and courage. So, our tea, Henry said slowly, trying to piece it all together, it's part of all that? The wars, the plantations, the fight for freedom? Yes? Jonathan nodded, a sad but proud smile on his face. All of it. When we drink this, we are taking part in that history. It's a reminder that the simple things in our lives are often connected to complicated stories, stories that involve people all over the world. It's a symbol of our past, both the good and the very bad. But it is also a symbol of change, a reminder that people can fight for what is right. It represents history, but also respect and the long, hard journey towards justice. He picked up his cup again, holding it as if it was something precious. The next day at school, Henry's teacher asked if anyone had any stories about Britain's connections to other parts of the world. Henry put his hand up. He told the class everything his grandfather had told him about the obsession with Chinese tea, the opium, the vast plantations in Assam, and the struggle of the Indian workers. When he finished, his teacher looked at him thoughtfully. "Thank you, Henry," she said. "That is a perfect example of why learning history is so important. It helps us understand the world as it is today and reminds us that our choices matter." And so, a simple cup of tea became something more for Henry. It was no longer just a warm drink for a rainy day. It was a lesson in a cup. It taught him that behind everyday objects lie complex histories of trade, power, and human struggle. Understanding that history doesn't change the taste of the tea, but it changes the person who drinks it. It encourages us to think more about where things come from and to value the people whose labour brings to us. It is a powerful step towards building a full and